I ran from my abusive husband, but my own parents led him straight to me. When I finally escaped my toxic marriage, I thought I'd be safe with my family. But just 3 days after I left, my husband was at their door. He was crying, begging, saying all the right things, and I was terrified. How did he find me? My parents gave him my location. They called it helping. I called it betrayal. So I packed my bags, left them behind too, and never looked back. Growing up, my parents were never the type to openly express love or encouragement. No matter how hard I worked or how much I achieved, they always found a way to point out where I fell short. If I got an A, they asked why it wasn't an A+. If I tried a new hobby, they'd call it a waste of time or insist it wasn't practical. While it wasn't outright abusive, their constant nitpicking and judgment left me feeling like I was never enough. And yet, for years I kept trying to make them proud, hoping that one day they'd see me as worthy. That longing for their approval followed me into adulthood, and it shaped a lot of the choices I made, especially the bad ones. When I was 23, I married my high school sweetheart, Jake. At the time, it felt like the logical next step. We'd been together since we were teenagers, we'd both finished college, and our families liked each other. My parents, who never seemed to approve of anything I did, were surprisingly supportive of Jake. Looking back, I think they were impressed by his family's wealth and his polished demeanor. For the first time, I thought I'd finally made a decision they could respect. But what started as a dream quickly turned into a nightmare. As soon as Jake and I got married, it was like a switch flipped. The kind, supportive boyfriend I thought I knew transformed into someone I barely recognized. He became controlling and manipulative, always criticizing me and finding ways to isolate me from my friends. His temper was unpredictable, and I found myself walking on eggshells every day, terrified of saying or doing the wrong thing. At first, I tried to rationalize his behavior. I told myself he was just going through a rough patch, that the pressures of adulthood and marriage were getting to him. I thought if I could just love him enough, be patient enough, he'd go back to being the person I fell in love with. But the more I gave, the worse he got. The man who had once called me his world now made me feel like I was nothing. It took me years to realize that no amount of love or patience was going to change him. Jake didn't want to change, he wanted control. And the longer I stayed, the more I lost myself. By the time I was 27, I knew I had to get out. The only problem was, I had no idea how to leave him safely. In the months leading up to my decision to leave, I started confiding in my parents. I told them bits and pieces about Jake's behavior, his anger, his manipulation, the way he'd chip away at my confidence until I felt like I couldn't do anything right. I didn't give them every detail, but I hoped they'd understand enough to help me when the time came. Unfortunately, I misjudged them. Instead of offering support or even just listening, they criticized me. My mom told me I was being dramatic, while my dad said that marriage wasn't supposed to be easy. "You made a commitment," he told me. "You don't just throw that away because things get hard." Their words stung, but I convinced myself that when push came to shove, they'd have my back. They were my parents after all. Surely they wouldn't let me down when I needed them most. When I finally worked up the courage to leave Jake, I went straight to my parents' house. It wasn't an easy decision. I knew they didn't fully believe me about how bad things had gotten, but I thought I'd be safe with them. My plan was to stay there for 2 weeks while I sorted out the logistics of the divorce. I didn't want Jake to know where I was because I knew he'd come looking for me, and I couldn't risk him finding me alone. For the first 3 days, things seemed fine. My parents didn't exactly roll out the red carpet, but they let me stay and didn't ask too many questions. I started to feel like maybe, just maybe, they were finally going to support me, but then everything fell apart. On the 3rd day, Jake showed up at my parents' house. I'll never forget the moment I heard his voice at the door, pleading with my parents to let him in. My stomach dropped and panic set in. I had been so careful to keep my location a secret. How did he know where I was? It didn't take long to figure out the answer. My parents had called him. "We thought he deserved a chance to talk to you," my mom said when I confronted her. "You're married, Deanna. You can't just run away every time things get hard. You two need to work this out." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Not only had they completely ignored everything I told them about Jake's behavior, but they had actively put me in danger by telling him where I was. My dad tried to justify it by saying they thought they were helping, but all I could think about was how vulnerable I was now that Jake knew where to find me. To his credit, Jake didn't hurt me that day. He cried and begged me to come back, promising he'd change and be the husband I deserved. But I knew better than to believe him. After that confrontation, I packed my things and left my parents' house. I couldn't trust them, not with my safety and certainly not with my future. I spent the next few weeks couchsurfing with friends while I worked on finalizing the divorce. My parents called me a few times during that period, but their messages weren't ones of support. They accused me of being selfish, immature, and irresponsible for leaving Jake. My mom even said I was bringing shame on the family by pursuing a divorce. Every conversation left me feeling worse, so I stopped answering their calls altogether. By the time the divorce was finalized, my parents had stopped reaching out entirely. It was like I didn't exist to them anymore. First, the silence hurt. No matter how bad things had gotten, a part of me had always hoped they'd come around and support me, but they didn't. And as much as it broke my heart, I had to accept that they were never going to be the parents I needed them to be. That was the last time I spoke to my parents for years. Looking back, their betrayal during my divorce was the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. It took me a long time to stop blaming myself for the way things turned out. For months after the divorce, I cried over the fact that my own parents had turned their backs on me. But eventually, I realized that I couldn't keep dwelling on their rejection. I had to move forward for myself and for the life I wanted to build. And so, that's exactly what I did. Leaving Jake and cutting ties with my parents left me feeling untethered, like I was floating without direction. For the first time in my life, I was truly alone. It was terrifying, but it was also the first step towards something I didn't even realize I needed: freedom. Without Jake's constant criticisms or my parents' suffocating control, I had the chance to figure out who I really was. The first year after the divorce was rough. I didn't have much in the way of savings, so I took on a few freelance graphic design gigs to make ends meet. My passion for design had always been something of an escape for me, and I clung to it like a lifeline. I moved to a new city where no one knew me, found a tiny studio apartment that I could barely afford, and focused on rebuilding from the ground up. It wasn't glamorous by any means, but it was mine. Every little step forward felt like a victory. The biggest turning point for me was starting therapy. I'd always thought therapy was for people with bigger problems, trauma survivors, people with severe mental health issues, or those with endless money to spend on self-improvement. But after years of feeling like I was drowning in guilt and self-doubt, I decided to give it a shot. My therapist, Dr. Moran, was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She didn't let me wallow in self-pity, but also never made me feel judged. One of the first things she helped me understand was how deeply my parents' treatment of me had shaped my life. Their constant criticism and lack of support had conditioned me to seek validation in all the wrong places, especially in my marriage to Jake. "It's not your fault," Dr. Moran told me during one of our first sessions, "but it is your responsibility to break the cycle." That stuck with me. For so long, I had blamed myself for everything that went wrong. My failed marriage, my strained relationship with my parents, even the fact that I hadn't noticed Jake's red flags sooner. But through therapy, I started to see that I wasn't broken or unworthy. I was just a person who had been hurt, trying to learn how to heal. Over the next few years, things slowly started to fall into place. My freelance work turned into a steady stream of clients, and I eventually landed a full-time job at a design agency. The pay wasn't great at first, but I loved the work and it gave me a sense of purpose. I poured myself into my career, taking on every project I could and building a portfolio I was proud of. With time, I worked my way up to a better position with a salary that allowed me to upgrade from my cramped studio to a one-bedroom apartment. It wasn't much, but it felt like a palace compared to where I'd started. More importantly, I began to find myself again. I started reconnecting with old friends, the ones Jake had isolated me from, and I made new ones along the way. I took up hobbies that I'd always been curious about, but had never dared to try: painting, yoga, even a pottery class that left me with lopsided bowls but a sense of accomplishment. For the first time in years, I felt free to explore who I was without fear of judgment or criticism. And then 2 years ago I met Eric. I wasn't looking for a relationship when I met him. In fact, I had pretty much sworn off dating after everything I'd been through with Jake. But Eric was different. He was warm, patient, and incredibly kind, the kind of person who made you feel safe just by being around him. We met at a networking event for creatives, and what started as a casual conversation about our favorite design software turned into hours of talking about everything from travel to our favorite books. Eric wasn't without his baggage. He was a single dad to a bright, energetic 8-year-old named Sophie, and he was upfront about how much she meant to him. "She's my priority," he told me on our second date. "If that's a deal breaker, I understand." It wasn't a deal breaker. If anything, it made me respect him even more. Watching Eric with Sophie was like seeing a masterclass in parenting. He was attentive and supportive but also firm when he needed to be. He gave her the kind of love and encouragement I'd always wanted from my own parents, and I knew from the start that he would be a wonderful partner. Our relationship grew slowly and naturally, and before I knew it I was falling in love, not just with Eric but with Sophie too. She was sweet and curious, always asking a million questions and cracking jokes that left me in stitches. Becoming part of their little family felt like coming home in a way I'd never experienced before. When Eric proposed a year ago, I didn't hesitate to say yes. We got married in a small, intimate ceremony with just a few close friends and family members. Sophie was the flower girl, and she took her role very seriously, scattering petals with the precision of a seasoned professional. It was the happiest day of my life, and for the first time, I felt like I had a family I could count on. Life with Eric and Sophie has been everything I never thought I'd have. We've built a home filled with love, laughter, and respect, a far cry from the chaos and toxicity of my past. Sophie calls me Dee, and while I would never try to replace her mom, who's still in her life, I've found a special place in her heart. Watching her grow and thrive has been one of the greatest joys of my life. I thought my parents were firmly in the rearview mirror at this point. I hadn't heard from them since the divorce, and I had long since stopped waiting for their approval or validation. As far as I was concerned, they were just part of the past. A chapter 1 had closed for good. But then about a month ago, everything changed. For years, I had lived my life under the assumption that my parents were a closed chapter. They hadn't reached out after the divorce, and I'd stopped expecting them to. I focused on my own healing, building a new life with Eric and Sophie, and finding happiness on my own terms. But about a month ago, everything changed. It started with a text from an old friend. "Have you seen this documentary?" they asked, followed by a link to a local filmmaker's project about financial and emotional abuse. "I think you should watch it. It's about Jake." I wasn't sure what to make of it. I hadn't kept tabs on Jake since the divorce, and I had no interest in digging up the past. But curiosity got the better of me, and later that evening I sat down to watch the documentary. What I saw left me speechless. The filmmaker had done a deep dive into Jake's life post-divorce, and it wasn't pretty. He had become a cautionary tale, the perfect case study of a manipulative, predatory abuser. The documentary detailed how he'd conned several women out of thousands of dollars, ruined their lives emotionally and financially, and even engaged in shady business deals that left his associates bankrupt. While they didn't use his real name, the details were so specific that anyone who knew Jake would recognize him instantly. Watching it felt like reliving a nightmare. I had always known Jake was a terrible husband, but I never imagined the depths of his deceit. Seeing the damage he'd done to others was horrifying, but it also gave me a strange sense of validation. For years, I'd felt like no one believed me when I tried to explain what I'd been through with him. Not my friends, not my parents, not even myself at times. But now there was undeniable proof of the kind of man he was. After the documentary aired, my phone blew up. Old friends and acquaintances reached out to say things like, "You dodged a bullet," and "I can't believe you went through that." It was overwhelming, but the biggest shock came when my parents reached out. The first message came from my mom. It was a long, emotional text where she apologized for not believing me all those years ago. She said she and my dad had watched the documentary, and it had opened their eyes to the truth about Jake. She begged me to give them a chance to make things right, promising that they regretted the way they had treated me. Then came the voicemails from my dad. In one, he sounded choked up as he said, "We were wrong. We see that now and we're so sorry. Please let us try to fix this." It was a lot to process. A part of me wanted to believe them. They were my parents after all, and deep down I had always hoped they would come around one day. But another part of me couldn't forget the way they had abandoned me when I needed them most. I couldn't forget how they had sided with Jake, put me in danger, and then cut me off completely. Their sudden change of heart felt more like guilt than genuine remorse. For days I wrestled with what to do. Eric, ever the voice of reason, told me I didn't owe them anything. They had years to reach out and make things right, he said. Why now? Because a documentary embarrassed them? Don't let them guilt you into letting them back in. He was right, of course, but it wasn't that simple for me. Despite everything, they were still my parents. There was a part of me that wanted to hear them out, if only to find some closure. I decided to meet them, but on my terms. I texted them back, saying we could talk at a neutral location, a small cafe halfway between their town and mine. When I arrived at the cafe, I was nervous but determined. I hoped my parents would take accountability for their actions, that they would apologize and show me they had truly changed. Instead, the conversation only confirmed my worst fears. My mom was the first to speak. We didn't know Jake was that bad, she said, her tone defensive. If we'd known, we would have done things differently. I waited for an apology, but it never came. Instead, she launched into a long explanation about how the documentary had been a wake-up call for them. We just want to move forward, she said. We're family, Deanna. We shouldn't let the past ruin our relationship. My dad chimed in, echoing her sentiments. We thought we were doing the right thing at the time, he said, as though that excused everything. We didn't mean to hurt you. Their words felt hollow. They weren't apologizing for how they treated me. They were just trying to justify it. At one point, my mom even said, maybe if you'd been clearer about what was going on with Jake, we wouldn't have misunderstood. That was the breaking point for me. Even now, after everything, they were still finding ways to blame me. I felt a lump rise in my throat as I realized they hadn't changed at all. They didn't want to make amends. They just wanted to absolve themselves of guilt. I think we're done here, I said, standing up. I'm happy with my life, and I don't want to reopen old wounds. Let's just leave things as they are. My parents looked shocked. My mom started to protest, but I didn't give her the chance. I walked out of the cafe, my heart heavy but my resolve unshaken. I thought that would be the end of it, but a week later they crossed a line I couldn't ignore. Sophie had a school play that weekend, something she'd been looking forward to for weeks. Eric and I were so proud of how hard she worked on her part, and we couldn't wait to see her perform. But as I scanned the audience that evening, my stomach dropped. Sitting a few rows back, smiling and chatting with other parents were my mom and dad. I hadn't told them about the play. They must have found out through Eric's Facebook, where he'd shared a post about it. But what infuriated me even more was the way they acted, as if they were part of the family. They introduced themselves to other parents as Sophie's grandparents, completely disregarding the boundaries I had set. Sophie, confused, leaned over and whispered to Eric, "Who are they?" Eric's jaw tightened. "We'll talk about it later, sweetie." I had to pull my parents aside and tell them to leave. My mom started crying, saying I was punishing them for their past mistakes. My dad tried to argue, saying they were just trying to be there for me now. But I wasn't having it. "This isn't about the past," I said through gritted teeth. "This is about you ignoring my boundaries and forcing your way into my life. Leave. Now." It took everything I had not to make a scene. They eventually left, but the damage was done. Eric and I were furious, not just at their blatant disregard for our wishes but at the fact that they had involved Sophie in their mess. That night, I sent them a text telling them their actions were unacceptable and that I needed space. "If you keep crossing boundaries," I wrote, "I will have no choice but to cut you off completely." I didn't get a response, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they pushed things even further. I thought that asking for space and setting clear boundaries would send a message to my parents that I wasn't ready, or willing, to have them in my life on their terms. I had hoped they would respect that, but deep down I think I already knew they wouldn't. My parents had always been the kind of people who thought they knew best, and apparently they hadn't changed at all. What I didn't realize was just how far they were willing to go to force their way back into my life. About a week after the school play incident, I got a call from Sophie's principal. The moment she introduced herself, my stomach dropped. "Hi, Deanna," she said. "I wanted to touch base about an unusual situation involving Sophie. Your parents reached out to the school directly and introduced themselves as Sophie's grandparents. They expressed interest in volunteering for an upcoming school event and mentioned that they had your permission." My heart stopped. "What?" I said, struggling to process her words. No, I didn't give them permission. They're not involved in Sophie's life. The principal sighed, her tone sympathetic. I thought it was odd, which is why I wanted to confirm with you first. They seemed insistent. I felt a mix of anger and disbelief. It wasn't enough that my parents had shown up uninvited to Sophie's play. They were now trying to wedge themselves into her life without my consent. Thank you for reaching out to me, I said, my voice shaking. Please don't allow them to participate in anything involving Sophie. They do not have my permission to be involved. The principal reassured me that she would handle it, but the call left me rattled. My parents' behavior was escalating, and it was clear they weren't going to stop until I took more drastic action. When I told Eric what had happened, he was livid. They've crossed the line, he said, pacing the living room. This isn't just about you anymore. They're trying to use Sophie to get to you, and that's unacceptable. I couldn't have agreed more. Sophie was innocent in all of this, and the last thing I wanted was for her to be dragged into my parents' mess. Eric and I decided it was time to consult a lawyer. We needed to figure out how to protect ourselves and Sophie from their interference. The next day, we sat down with an attorney and explained the situation in detail. From my parents' betrayal during my divorce to their attempts to force their way into Sophie's life, I laid it all out. The lawyer listened carefully, then assured us we had a strong case for a restraining order. It's clear they're disregarding your boundaries, she said, and their behavior at Sophie's school is particularly concerning. You have every right to protect your family. Hearing her validate my concerns felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For so long I had doubted myself, wondering if I was overreacting or being too harsh. But now, with Eric and our lawyer in my corner, I finally felt like I had the strength to take the next step. Filing the restraining order was emotionally exhausting. I had to recount everything, every betrayal, every instance of them undermining me, and every boundary they had crossed. I included evidence where I could, like the messages they'd sent after the school play, and the principal's statement about their attempt to volunteer. Reliving it all was painful, but I knew it was necessary. When the papers were finally filed, Eric and I felt a sense of relief. For the first time, it felt like we were taking control of the situation. But the relief was short-lived. My parents' reaction to being served the restraining order was exactly what I expected. Manipulative and full of blame. The day they were served, my mom left me a voicemail. She was crying, saying she couldn't believe I was tearing the family apart, and accusing me of being ungrateful. We just wanted to be there for you, she sobbed. Why are you punishing us for trying to make things right? My dad, on the other hand, sent an email from a new account, since I had blocked his original one, accusing me of being cold-hearted. You're letting Eric poison you against us, he wrote. We're your parents, Deanna. You can't just erase us from your life like this. Their messages hurt, but not for the reasons they probably intended. It wasn't their guilt trips or accusations that got to me. It was the fact that, even now, they couldn't take accountability for their actions. Instead of apologizing or reflecting on how their behavior had impacted me, they doubled down on their narrative that I was the problem. The restraining order was granted a few weeks later. It included provisions preventing my parents from contacting me, Eric, or Sophie in any way, as well as prohibiting them from coming within 500 feet of our home or Sophie's school. If they violated the order, they would face legal consequences. To ensure we were fully protected, Eric and I took additional precautions. We updated our privacy settings on all social media accounts, ensuring my parents couldn't see anything about our lives. I also informed close friends and family about the situation, making it clear that anyone who tried to act as a go-between would be cut off. Most people were supportive, but I could tell a few thought I was being too harsh. I didn't care. My priority was protecting my family, not pleasing everyone else. For a while, things seemed to calm down. My parents didn't contact us directly, though I later learned from a family friend that they were still trying to paint me as the villain. According to the friend, my mom had been telling people I was brainwashed by Eric, and that the restraining order was just me being dramatic. It stung to hear, but it didn't surprise me. My parents had always been experts at deflecting blame. What did surprise me was how much better I felt after the restraining order was in place. For years, I had carried the weight of my parents' criticism and manipulation, always wondering if I was the problem. But now I could see their behavior for what it was: toxic and self-serving. Setting boundaries and enforcing them wasn't easy, but it was the only way to protect myself and my family. The final straw came a few weeks later, when I received a call from the mail forwarding service I used for my old address. They informed me that several letters had been forwarded to my current address, all from my parents. I hadn't opened them, but I kept them as evidence in case my parents tried to contest the restraining order. When I told Eric about the letters, he shook his head in disbelief. "They'll never stop, will they?" he said. "No," I replied, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. "But at least now we have the tools to keep them out of our lives." After the restraining order was granted, I felt a cautious sense of relief. For the first time in years, I had a clear boundary in place between my parents and my family, backed by legal protection. But the journey wasn't over yet. As much as I wanted to believe the restraining order would be enough to make them stop, I couldn't ignore the fact that my parents had a long history of disregarding boundaries. And unfortunately, they proved me right sooner than I had hoped. A few weeks after the restraining order went into effect, I received another call from Sophie's school principal. My heart sank as soon as I saw the school's number on my phone. "Hi, Deanna," she said. "I wanted to let you know that your parents attempted to contact the school again." I felt my stomach churn. What did they say this time? "They called and asked for information about Sophie's schedule," the principal explained. "They claimed they had permission from you and Eric to pick her up after school. Of course, we didn't give them any information, but I thought you should know." I clenched my fists, trying to steady my voice. "Thank you for letting me know. I appreciate you keeping us informed." After I hung up, I sat there for a moment, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. Even with a restraining order in place, my parents were still trying to insert themselves into Sophie's life. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting my daughter from people who had no regard for our boundaries or her well-being. When I told Eric about the incident, he was furious. "This is exactly why we filed the restraining order," he said, pacing the living room. "They don't care about rules or boundaries. They're just going to keep pushing until they get what they want." "I know," I said quietly. "But what do we do now? We've already taken every legal step we can." Eric stopped pacing and sat down beside me, taking my hand. "We stay vigilant," he said. "We document everything, and if they violate the restraining order again, we report it to the authorities. But most importantly, we don't let them drag us down. We have to keep living our lives." His words gave me strength. For so long, I had let my parents' behavior dictate my emotions and my decisions. But Eric was right. It was time to focus on the life we were building together, not the chaos my parents were trying to create. The next day, I contacted our lawyer to inform her of the latest incident. She assured me that my parents' actions were a clear violation of the restraining order, and that we had every right to report it. "If they continue to push boundaries, we can escalate this further," she said. "You're doing the right thing by standing firm." With her guidance, I documented the incident and reported it to the authorities. It was exhausting and emotionally draining, but it also reinforced my resolve. My parents weren't going to stop, but I wasn't going to let them win. Over the following weeks, things began to settle down. My parents stopped trying to contact Sophie's school, and I didn't receive any more forwarded letters or emails. It was as if they had finally realized that their attempts to force their way into our lives weren't going to work. For the first time in months, I started to feel a sense of peace. Eric and I decided to celebrate by planning a family trip with Sophie. We chose a cozy cabin in the mountains, far away from the stress and chaos of the past few months. The trip was exactly what we needed, a chance to reconnect as a family and create positive memories together. Sophie loved every minute of it, from hiking trails to roasting marshmallows by the fire. Watching her laugh and play, I felt a sense of gratitude that I hadn't felt in a long time. This was what family was supposed to feel like: love, joy, and safety. When we returned from the trip, I decided to take one final step to protect my peace. I blocked every possible avenue my parents could use to contact me: phone numbers, email addresses, and even social media accounts. I also informed close friends and family members that I didn't want any updates about my parents or their lives. If they chose to stay in touch with my parents, that was their choice, but I made it clear that I didn't want to be involved in any way. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was necessary. For years, I had held on to the hope that my parents would change, that they would see the pain they caused me and make an effort to be better. But their repeated actions had shown me that they weren't interested in change. They were only interested in control. Letting go of that hope was painful, but it was also liberating. I no longer felt the need to prove myself to them or seek their approval. I was free. One evening, as Eric and I sat on the couch watching Sophie play with her toys, he turned to me and said, "You know, you're the strongest person I know." I smiled, tears welling up in my eyes. "I don't always feel strong," I admitted. "But I'm trying." "You've been through so much," he said, wrapping an arm around me. "And yet here you are, building a beautiful life for us and for Sophie. That takes strength." Looking around at my little family, I realized he was right. I had survived an abusive marriage, rebuilt my life from scratch, and protected my family from toxic people who had tried to tear us down. I wasn't perfect, and I still had moments of doubt and fear, but I had come so far. As I sat there watching Sophie laugh and Eric smile, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. For the first time, I wasn't looking back at the past or worrying about the future. I was living in the moment, surrounded by the people I loved most in the world. My parents might never change, and I had made my peace with that. What mattered now was the life I was building with my real family, the one I had chosen for myself.